Good morning. I didn't know if anybody would be here because we've got some really lovely sunshine where I am. But welcome to everybody who is joining us live, everybody who's watching us on catch up, because I'm sure that lots of you will be. And if you're watching on catch up on Facebook, do feel free to comment along as if you're watching live. So welcome to everybody. The question I had you to think about while you were waiting for people, while we were waiting for people to join is, what does reform mean? If you reform something, what does it mean? Or reform? So you need to think about the root word of form and then what re means. And when we're talking about reform, you can think of reform in lots of ways. I mean, I could reform my modelling clay if I had some, from one shape to another shape. But what we're talking about when we're talking about reform is, as some of you have said, is re-educating somebody or trying to help change somebody's behaviour or modify someone's behaviour. Because obviously, if you've been with me for the last 6 weeks, we have been looking at crime and punishment. And this concept of reform hasn't been there at all. All it's been is, if you break the law, then an awful punishment happens to you, usually capital punishment. And we hit the pinnacle of that last week when we were looking at the bloody code. Now we're going to move on to the Victorian era. So we're going to leave the Georgians behind and we're going to move on to the Victorian era today, because we're going to now look at a change in attitudes which started in the Georgian era, where people started to think, hang on a minute, it shouldn't just be about sort of giving these hideous punishments. Maybe we should think about reform. Make somebody nice again. I like that one. Now, another one, and we're not going to discuss this one because there isn't an answer, this is an interpretation, is how can you judge the extent to which someone has reformed? Because that's what makes this really, really hard, this concept of reform. Because you can put in lots of things to reform, try and reform someone's behaviour, try and reform someone's tendencies, but actually, can you ever judge the extent to which someone has reformed? And so it's a really hard one, really, really hard. I'll leave you to discuss that with your grown-ups later on. Because what we're going to look at today, session 6, is we are going to look at Victorian prisons. Now, prisons had kind of existed before, but they were kind of places you were just kept while you were awaiting trial, if you'd done something, wrong, and they were trying to work out what to do with you. But this concept of a prison as a place of reform is a very new thing and something that we use today. So if somebody breaks the law and it's a serious crime, we put them into prison with the aim of reform. And that idea was born in the Victorian era. And what we're going to look at today, our kind of key question, is how bad were Victorian prisons? Were they all right? Were they really bad? Were they hideous? Were they quite nice? Because this is, again, a question of interpretation. And what I also need you to think about is comparing it to the previous eras, because that's what's important, not necessarily judging it on today's standards, but previous eras as well. So if we think about trials by ordeal in the medieval era, actually was a Victorian prison better than having to go through that? If we think about all of the serious crimes and then the very silly crimes that people did in the Georgian era that would end in death, how does Victorian prison compare to that? We started to think about transportation, moving prisoners, to other countries, potentially inhospitable places to kind of get rid of them. How does that compare to Victorian prisons? Because do you know what? It's really easy to judge it on 2023 standards, but we've got to think about what came before, because remember, we're looking at that continuity and change, and that's what we're going to look at today. And what we're going to start off with, because a lot of this is about skills, this term of source skills. And so we've looked at inference, so that's one thing of what can you learn from a source. But if you get to GCSE history, something else you'll be asked to do is to decide how useful a source is. And what that means is, how good is it for telling you something? Now, nothing is ever absolutely perfectly useful and nothing is ever useless. So you never would ever answer, if you ever sent this question at GCSE or A-level or whatever, how useful, you never go, no, it's totally useless. Doesn't help me at all. Because it's always useful in some way. But then there's never ever anything that's like perfectly useful. So it's somewhere around the middle. You're going to have to judge. Is it like really fairly useful or not that useful? So this question is, how useful is this source for telling you about life in Victorian England? And so therefore, what you need to work out is, what does it actually tell you? What can you, I'm going to turn my camera off, what does it actually tell you about Victorian London? And then if it tells you an awful lot, it's therefore useful. Now, looking at a source of provenance, which is where it's come from, can be part of its usefulness, but not in this time. It doesn't really matter who drew it, and it really doesn't matter. It was drawn in the, whether or not it was, who drew it. That's not relevant today. What's relevant is this particular picture and what it actually tells you. So somebody's saying that it looks incredibly busy and overcrowded. So it's very useful for teaching you that the industrial revolution that we went through led to a boom in towns, and it looks incredibly busy. Lots of people say it looks very dirty. Absolutely. We can see lots of rubbish. We can see people trying to sweep up, but then other people throwing stuff into the streets. So it does look very dirty, and I like the word grimy. That's a really good one. Another person said that it appears that there's lots of different classes. You can see incredibly rich people, you can see incredibly poor people, so you can see a real difference in economic status. Absolutely. You can see a child at the front that's begging. Absolutely. So again, you could say that it looks like it's a place that, poor people are begging. So there's clearly an issue with poverty. There looks like other people that maybe are looking a little bit more sinister and maybe pickpocketing or thieves. Really good. Jack's worked out there's lots of people in quite fancy clothes, but there's also the little boy at the front is barefoot. So it's showing you quite a lot about the varying quality of life. Doesn't tell you anything about toilets though, so you can't you can't use your own knowledge when you're looking at a usefulness. You can't say, oh well, they didn't have it. It shows they didn't have any toilets, because you can't see that from that picture. So let's have a little look. So it clearly does show you. It's really useful for showing you that in the Victorian era there was a clear rich-poor divide still. So you've got incredibly wealthy people in their top hats and their carriages, and then the little boy at the front who is barefooted and looks incredibly unkept. It is also incredibly useful for showing you, which somebody else put, about the real development of towns and cities. This place is incredibly overcrowded. So someone says there seems to be something of a commotion. Well, there isn't a commotion. It just shows you how busy these towns and cities are. It shows you, it's useful for teaching you that more people were concentrated in towns and cities, because we'd gone through in the Victorian era the Industrial Revolution, which basically meant that we industrialised. We were the first country in the world to industrialise. We built massive factories where we industrialised lots and lots of things, from making cloth to mining, to lots of things became mechanicalised. And as a result, people moved to huge towns and cities. So absolutely, that's another one. It clearly shows you child labour, because you can see lots of children sweeping at the back, and like what looks like a couple of young apprentices. So again, it's useful for showing you that children are not at school, because if children were at school, they wouldn't be there, would they? And so you can see that there's lots and lots of child labour going on, and also so you can see at the back there's like a lady or a gentleman doing this, and then next to them you have a road sweeper that is very clearly a child. So it's useful for showing you that child labour. And also there's a very small person which looks like a child with a basket. So again, some sort of delivery person. So you can clearly see child labour going on. Overcrowding, which we've looked at, you can clearly see it's overcrowding. So yeah. And again, like you've all said, it's clearly incredibly unsanitary. The streets look absolutely disgustingly filthy and dirty. There's people kind of brushing up the dirt and the filth. And so therefore, it does tell you that it's very unsanitary. So actually, just this picture can show you an awful lot about what life was like in Victorian England. So if I was asked this question in an exam or just because someone asked me, I'd say it's incredibly useful. But also it does have limitations. It doesn't tell you, if we were looking at it, how useful is it for telling you about life in Victorian England? Well, like you say, it doesn't tell you the percentage of children involved in child labour. It doesn't tell you what the realities of sanitation were. It doesn't tell you how many rich and how many poor people there were. You can't really see the extent of that. You can't actually see, for example, how overcrowded all cities were. This just tells you about London, because this is particularly London. So you would definitely need more, but you can see an awful lot, particularly overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, child labour, and clear rich-poor divide. And that is the kind of 4 big things that this source tells you, and the 4 big things that we really need to know to start today's lesson. So as I've said, Queen Victoria reigned from 1837 until 1901. So we're looking at the Victorian era, and this is the time where we became one of the most powerful and richest countries in the world. And this is due to the fact that we industrialised. So we had lots of factories, lots of machines, and we industrialised. And an example of that is the steam locomotives were built during the invented during the Victorian era. And cars were invented, and that was the start of when we industrialised. So that's the era we are looking at. And so what we now need to think of, if we had this huge flux of people to towns and cities, and this huge industrial revolution, and all these people working in factories, did it or did it not cause a boom in crime? So I've got 2 records here. I've got records from 1800. So if we go back to Queen Victoria, so just before she was on the throne, so just before the Victorian era. And then I have crimes in 1840, if we go back to our period of time, just after Queen Victoria had come to the throne, and right in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. So what do you reckon in 1800, how many crimes do you think were recorded per year? And in 40 years, what do you think the increase was? So I want you to have a little guess. I did look at how many crimes were reported in the UK every year, and it's an awful lot. But remember, in 1800, the population was a lot less. So in 1800, how many crimes do you think were reported per year? Have a guess. And by 1840, how much? This is what I'm more interested in. Do you think there would have been a significant increase or not? So someone's saying they absolutely do believe there would have been an increase, a 10-fold increase. So 1800, 10,000 crimes is one guess. Anybody else going to guess for 1800? And then what do you think by 1840? So 200 crimes in 1800, 500 crimes a year recorded in 1800. How much do you think? So do you think, click the thumbs up if you think that this is going to increase significantly. So we've got 1,000 in 1800, a million in 1800. Click the thumbs up if you think, I can see 1 thumbs up going up. Click the thumbs up button on the emojis if you think we're going to see a huge increase in crimes per year. So lots of people saying yes, and I can see in my window that lots of little clicks on the thumbs up. So yes, let's have a look. Well, in 1800, there are around 5,000 crimes recorded every year in England. And by 1840, this had increased to 20,000. Now, this may not seem a lot of crimes, 5,000 recorded crimes. Recorded is the key one, because not everybody would have chosen to record, have the crimes recorded. But what you need to look at is in 40 years, you've gone from 5,000 recorded crimes to 20,000 recorded crimes. So there is no doubt about it, the industrialisation of Britain causes a boom in crime. And so this leads then to, well, what do you do about it? Now, all of a sudden, we have these huge towns, these huge cities. People have moved from the countryside to these towns and cities to work in these new industrial factories. We have a boom in the population, and we also have a boom in crime. And so the question is, well, what on earth do you do about it? Because many Victorians were really worried that statistics were going up and up and up. And you often see that in the news now about, the latest thing at the moment is the volume of knife crime that's going up in society. And it was no different in the Victorian era. Victorians were really, really worried about crime. And they could clearly see that crime was, in 40 years, a fourfold change. But also Victorians were a little bit like the end of the Georgian era. A lot of them weren't really very supportive of hanging as a punishment, particularly when you've got so many more people that are committing crimes. And so this created the problem. Well, what should we do about it then? We don't really like hanging people. We've got loads of more people breaking the law. Well, what are we going to do about it? And the decision was, well, why don't we go down the idea of trying to reform people? Rather than just saying, you've broken the law, we're going to hang you, or we're going to do something horrible to you, what we're going to do is, why don't we reform these people? Why don't we build huge buildings and we house these people in these huge buildings, and then what we'll do is we will reform these people who have broken the law. And remember, lots of those laws were still the breaking of the laws, were still things like stealing, because lots of people were still incredibly poor. And that's what happened. So during the Victorian era, lots and lots and lots of prisons were built. And in fact, a lot of our prisons today started off as Victorian prisons. In fact, between 1842 and 1877, we built 90 prisons. And it cost the economy millions of pounds, even in the Victorian era. And we built lots and lots and lots of prisons. And the idea was that this would be the main form of punishment. So right up until this point, the main form of punishment, as we've seen, is capital punishment. You break the law, something awful will happen to you, but in most instances, or a lot of instances, you will be put to death. Now we've got a complete change. We're going to build these buildings and we're going to reform people. This is going to be the punishment. You're going to be removed from society. You're going to be held in a prison, and we are going to reform you of your ways. And this is where this idea of prison comes from. This is a photograph of a Victorian prison. And so this is the sort of question I've got for you now is, okay, so this is the idea. What would you expect a Victorian prison to be like? If you're going to reform people, are you going to go from a complete change, a revolution in crime and punishment? What would you expect it to be like? I'll turn my camera off so you can see the picture. Some of these Victorian prisons, I've been to a Victorian prison. I went last summer, and it was absolutely fascinating, actually. They had loads and loads of different cells, and they were all set up from different periods of time, from the Victorian era all the way up to the modern day. It was a fascinating place, but my children hated it because they said it had a really horrible feel to it. So what do we think? What do you think it would be like? What do you expect the prison to be like? So it does look quite nice, actually. The architecture looks quite nice, but actually probably not very nice, someone's saying. It looks quite nice architecturally, but probably not very nice for the prisoners. What would you do then? How do you think they're going to reform? Let's have a prediction. How do you think they are going to reform all of these prisoners from the Victorian era. So somebody's been arrested for stealing, they get sent to Victorian prison. How do you think they are going to be reformed? So it looks like not great food, could be cold, might be quite damp, maybe they'll be put to work. Absolutely, good ideas. Well, in the Victorian era, the intention was that prisoners would be reformed by various things. This was the theory. There would be good Christian teaching involved in the prisons. There would be lots of hard work, and there would be lots of silence in order that the prisoners could contemplate their wrongdoing and understand that they'd done the wrong thing, and that's how that they shouldn't behave like that, and then they could be potentially released dependent on the crime. So that was the idea. We'll build these prisons, we'll reform these prisoners, and we'll reform them using good Christian teaching, a bit of hard work, and some silent contemplation. Doesn't sound too bad, does it? Education is a really big one. It does sound quite a good idea, doesn't it? Right? Now we're going to look at how they did it and thinking about your views as to how bad you think the Victorian prisons were. But the thing is that we must get in our head, Victorian era, a change in attitude. This is very much a change from retribution, which we have seen in all of the periods of time, to reform. So retribution is no more, it's all about reform. And there were two systems of correction, and people philosophized through the Victorian era about what the best way was to reform people that had broken the law. There's some really interesting people you can go and look up who came up with loads of different ideas about how we should correct people that had broken the law. Now, the first system that was employed in some Victorian prisons was the separate system. And this was the separate system. So rule number 1, prisoners must be kept separated and alone at all times. So you were kept in a cell on your own, and you had to be alone at all times. And you should spend most of your time in your cell. So very rarely would you be allowed out of your cell, because you need to be kept separate from everybody and alone. And the theory was that if you were alone on your own in a cell for most of the day, that you would sit and contemplate your wrongdoing. And then what they had in the cell was a crank, which is basically a handle that you had to turn. And the handle had absolutely no purpose. It didn't do anything, but you had to crank the handle thousands, hundreds, thousands of times in order to get your food. And if you didn't crank the handle, you didn't get your dinner. Okay, so that was the other thing. While you're in your cell contemplating, turn the crank in return for your food. If you do have to leave your cell for any reason, because you have to be kept separate and alone at all times, you would have to wear a mask so that you can't be seen by anyone else, and you can't see anybody else. So that was rule number 4. And the reason that you would be let out, obviously, was so that you could exercise for short periods of time. So if you were let out, you'd have to wear a mask so that you couldn't see anybody, nobody could see you, and that was literally exercise, and it happened it had to happen in silence, and you had to be kept around at least 4.5 meters away from any other prisoner, so that you couldn't whisper to them or touch them, whisper, anything. So you had to be kept 4.5 meters away from any other prisoner. And if you were well behaved, then you could have extra food for your dinner. So if you sat in your cell and you sat in silence and you looked like you were contemplating your crimes and you were operating your crank, then you might get some extra dinner. So that was the first Victorian concept, the separate system. The second idea was the silent system, which sounds a little bit similar and it is, but it is slightly different. So the silent system is that you can be around other prisoners. So you're not completely isolated. You can be around other prisoners, but you have to be silent at all times. You're not allowed to talk because remember, they believed that you needed silent contemplation. The reason behind this system is that you need to work together. So you need to do some work in order to atone for your crimes. So it needs to be really hard work, but it needs to be boring and it needs to be repetitive so that you can sit and be, made to do this really hard work to, again, kind of think about the crime that you committed. Now, under the silent system, you were allowed to talk, but only for 30 minutes a day and only if you had been well behaved. But you were allowed to talk under the silent system, but only for 30 minutes. The other idea was that you must sleep on hard, uncomfortable beds. So there was to be no luxury in the prison. It wasn't to be an enjoyable experience. So you must sleep on hard and uncomfortable beds. And also your food must only be bread and water. So you weren't to be fed anything nice. You were only to be allowed bread and water, and that was it. And the idea of both systems were that it hoped that prisoners would reform, that if they were silent, they would think about their crimes, they would atone for their crimes, and then they could be released as reformed citizens. But I've seen somebody posting about the psychological impact of that. Now, the psychological impact of being kept in silence is huge for the human being. And you're absolutely right that the lack of human interaction did break people. It did cause humongous mental health issues, depression, anxiety, and the suicide rates in Victorian prisons were incredibly high. And they were incredibly high because actually these systems, we're designed to be with other people and talk to other people, and actually particularly the separation system where you are kept, you never see another person, because anytime you're near another person, you're wearing a mask. You literally don't see another person, you don't talk to somebody, you have to be silent. Actually, that does send your brain into humongous turmoil, and people did have incredibly serious mental breakdowns, and suicide rate was incredibly hard. And these were the two systems of correction that were employed. Now, some of the hard work that you were expected to do, what do we think this is? What do we think this is? So I have talked to you about this one. What does this look like? What do we think? So this is the crank. This is what you would have, this handle, no point, just do this over and over and over again, thousands of times a day. And you just do it for no reason other than if you don't do it, they won't feed you. Okay, no point. It's the other thing you need to think about, doing lots of activities for just no point. So this is the crank. What do we think this is? What do we think this is? Now this wouldn't be in the separation system, this would be under the silent system because these people are obviously together. What do you think these people are doing? They are treading on a wheel. Now, in a lot of prisons, no point. Didn't do anything. You just got on it and you treaded on it and it rotated and you just kept doing it for hours and hours and hours on end for no reason. Some were connected to like mills and machines that they did something, but a lot of them didn't do anything. No point. Just get on and do it for no reason. So it's a treadmill. What do you think this lady is doing? This person is doing? What's this person doing? She's got something in front of her. Looks a little bit like hair. And looks like she's got some in her hand. She looks like she maybe is untangling string. Someone's got it. It's picking oakum. So picking oakum. So we'll talk about this one in a second because I'm just going to move on to the last one. So yeah, sorting out something. What do we think this person's doing? What do you think this person's doing? Oh, some people have obviously done Victorian prisons because it's a shot drill. Awesome, I'm very, very impressed. So these are the things that you're expected to do. And these are to do with hard labour. So as I said, a treadmill is basically treading, using all your weight really hard to move. And most of the treadmill wheels didn't do anything. Some of them were connected to machinery, but very few were. The shot drill was basically pick up a heavy cannonball, walk a few paces, put it down, pick it up, walk to the other side, put it down, pick it up, walk to the other side, put it down, pick it up, walk to... Again, no point, and you'd be expected to do that for hours on end. And picking oakum, basically lots and lots of rope and picking any tar from it. So they often came from the shipping industry, picking any tar, which is sort of like hard, black sort of gloop off of the rope. So picking it off. And so you've got like lots of frayed little bits of rope. Now there was a point to that because they used those frayed bits of rope to seal the holes in ships. But again, your fingers would bleed and it would be really horrible work. And the crank, turning a crank up to 10,000 times a day in order to earn your meals. Would it make dangerous criminals extra strong? Well, yes, in theory, it would be making you stronger, but the aim of it is about trying to put you would be exhausted. So it would make you strong, but it would make you exhausted. And so the other thing is, don't forget that you're only eating bread. So you're not really eating a lot of nutritional things. So really difficult, particularly lots of you saying the ones that aren't very productive. So not very productive at all. I think that's a bit soul destroying. Just imagine if you're growing up and said, right, we're going to do some study today. There's no point in it whatsoever. So yeah, not enough food to get strong. So let's have a little think then. How do you think it would have felt to do that same senseless activity thousands of times, every day, day after day? How do you think you'd feel? How do you think after a few weeks you'd feel? How do you think after a few months you would feel? And do you think that this is an effective form of correction? Do you think this would reform people? Now, exactly like last week, you will find people have lots of different answers. Some people would say, do you know what? If life was that bad and that miserable and that hard work, I think it would teach you not to break the law when you left prison. Some people would argue that actually you have in prison some of the most vulnerable people of society. People that have stolen food or pickpocketed because they can't afford to feed their families. And so subjecting them to this is probably not going to make a blind bit of difference to the fact that they broke the law in the first place. Some of you might say that actually it would make you feel trapped, it would make you feel hopeless, and lots of you talking about the fact that it would make you, it would actually break you to the point that you possibly wouldn't want to live anymore. And suicide rates in Victorian prisons were a huge problem. It would absolutely break people. And there's a difference between reforming people and breaking people, because they wouldn't actually, how are you supposed to reform someone who is completely mentally broken? Some people might say it might make you angrier. Absolutely. Potentially it would make you angrier. Certainly in the short term. I don't know whether you'd have the energy to be angry in the long term. But really tricky one. Then what you've got to do is you've also got to compare it to the previous eras. Is this any worse or is it better than a trial by ordeal? Is it any better or worse than life under the bloody code? is it any better or worse than some of the other eras and how they dealt with people that committed crimes? So those are things I'm going to leave you to think about, because the answer is not that easy. Don't forget, in the description above and the description below, we have a link to our Time Explorers pack. Go and head over and download it. There's lots and lots of activities for you to get on with, including a day in the life of a Victorian prisoner found in the planning pack. Find out about Victorian workhouses. That's something else you can do. There's a difference between a workhouse and a prison. So what's a workhouse? There's a great pack you can go and look at. What was the difference, and what do you think is worse? It was more severe, a workhouse or a prison? There are some hard labour activities found in the planning pack. So if your grown-ups feel like some submersive history, there's some hard labour activities that you can have a go at. But obviously be careful, because I don't want you doing shot drill in your backyards in this heat. And also start to think about this move towards prevention rather than crime. I think it's definitely, that is one thing that is good about the Victorians, this idea of moving towards prevention rather than severe punishments. But actually life has moved on a little bit more from that in today's society. Try and research, because we now have non-custodial alternatives to prison, where you don't go to prison at all. So we've moved crime and punishment on, like punishments on, even more, because now we have opportunities for certain crimes. We don't even go to prison now. We have non-custodial prisons, punishments. Go and have a look at non-custodial punishments. Do you think they're as effective as a prison sentence? But that is lots of activities for you to go and look at. Where can you find the crime stats for 1800? Well, I'm about to stop, and then you'll be able to scooch back into the video and find it. So, interesting. Modern prisons are also terrible and also fail human rights. So that's something else that you can definitely look at. I found it really, when I went to this prison, it was Shrewsbury Prison, if you're interested, last year. I was surprised about how late, I think it was something like the 1990s, that prisoners had toilets in their cells. And up until that point, they had to still use chamber pots. And they had a sluice room at this prison where you would have to go every day and wash out your chamber pot. And I don't think they had toilets. It was maybe the 1980s, but definitely it could have even been as late as the 1990s before they had actual flushing toilets in their cells. Really interesting place. Although my children hated it because they found it very scary. It had a very odd aura. But anyway, have a lovely week. Enjoy the sunshine, and I'll see you soon.